Um, all right, and we begin the presentation about safe routes to school by Dakota Hewlett. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to meet the group. I'm new to the state of Maine. I moved in October from Michigan, so everything I've been doing in the past 5 months has been new to me. Meeting a lot of new people, going to a lot of new places, and learning about a lot of the projects that are underway in communities all across the state of Maine. I've been fortunate enough in the last 5 months to spend time in southern Maine, as well as coastal Maine and way up in the county as well. So it's been great to see a lot of things going on throughout the state. I'm the active transportation planner for Maine Department of Transportation, so that means I deal with anything that has to do with bicycle or pedestrian infrastructure planning, bike ped safety issues, as well as I administer Maine's iteration of the Federal Transportation Alternatives Grants Program, which in Maine we call the Bicycle Pedestrian Funding Program. And that is also where it's a funding source we can use for safe routes to school type projects as well, which I think is what you wanted to talk about primarily today. I'll hit on a couple of other things first before we dive into safe routes, though. We are just finishing up our first ever Maine State Active Transportation Plan. So that will be our guidance document for the Department of Transportation moving forward, and how we undertake efforts that support bicycling and walking and active transportation types of work in the future. So that's, in a nutshell, it's kind of like almost my job description moving forward. I take that document, probably will, once we have that final version, I'll print one out and take that everywhere I go. But we're excited to have this active transportation plan, and that should be released to the public here very soon, in the next week or two, hopefully, along with a couple of the other plans in the family of plans that we're working on. So that's an exciting role, and I think there's some goals outlined in there that both apply to safe routes to school, as well as improving connectivity for vulnerable road users within our communities. So for your group across Portland, making sure that neighborhoods are connected, making sure that we can work together with the city and other partners to provide additional infrastructure and services that support active transportation. So I think that's a great tool for us, great tool for me moving forward, being new to this job, to have this active transportation plan as my guidance document moving forward that I'll be able to reference and utilize and help to implement. So that's a really cool thing, and I'm really fortunate to be coming into this new role right at the time that we have our first active transportation plan. We are also working on a couple of other things coming directly out of that active transportation plan that will be looking at an update of our complete streets policy. So that's a policy that DOT has that dictates when we look at different types of infrastructure projects that we're building, whether it's brand new things, new highway, new bridges, new streets, or rehabilitation of existing infrastructure, and how we integrate vulnerable road users, people walking, people bicycling into that, into that work. So that will be an update of that policy. The policy has been around since about 2013. We're going to take that policy, do some public engagement, do some stakeholder engagement, and come out this year with a new revised complete streets policy that will help us to dictate where we do certain types of complete streets treatments, how other partners are involved, how municipalities are involved, how our cost sharing agreements are involved, really tying together complete streets into the different types of programs within the DOT as well, whether that's our bridge program, our highway program, or some of our other more unique projects that we are undertaking sometimes as well. Before I jump into safe routes to school, any other questions on the active transportation plan or just in general?
I see Zach has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks again for coming.
Mm-hmm.
You said this active transportation policy. I missed. Is this policy that's been voted on by the legislature?
No, the complete streets policy is a internal department policy that dictates how the department approaches infrastructure projects. So it's not a law, but it's kind of an operational policy for MaineDOT and how we evaluate projects, how we evaluate biking and walking through the design process of our roadway and bridge projects and our active transportation specific projects as well, and then how we go about working with our external partners and municipalities and implementing those. So it's not a law, it's not legislative policy, but it's internal kind of operational policy.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So moving on from there, we'll talk about safe routes to school a little bit. The term I find, so previous to this job, I worked in the public recreation kind of industry. I worked for the Department of Natural Resources in Michigan within our state parks division, and worked on a lot of non-motorized trails, hiking trails, biking trails, mountain biking trails, active transportation trails, all that kind of thing, from much more of a recreation and natural resources lens. Now that I'm here in Maine with the DOT, I do some very similar work and work with a lot of similar partners, but from a transportation kind of lens. So there's some differences. The perspective is great, and I think my past experience is great to help work with some of our recreation partners here in Maine as well. But I'm learning more and more about safe routes to schools, and there's kind of two aspects. There's a funding aspect. So the Federal Transportation Alternatives Program grant program has been referred to as Safe Routes to Schools, and Safe Routes project elements have been eligible expenditures for quite a while, and they still are through that TAP program. So we've got that funding program that helps us get to design and implementation of infrastructure project for Safe Routes to Schools. And I also work a bit on the education and outreach kind of side of Safe Routes to Schools. So that's working with here in Maine, primarily the Bicycle Coalition of Maine, and in their what they call the Bicycle Pedestrian Safety Education Program, where BCM will go out and do presentations and education sessions with schools across the state, working with school-age kids to get them on bikes, learn how to ride properly in the roadway, learn how to be a pedestrian safely, learn how to just navigate their community at a kind of a human scale level safely. And they're working in communities across the state with elementary school, middle school, high school age kids, as well as some adult bike ped safety education programs. So when I use the term Safe Routes to Schools, I try to classify whether I'm talking about Safe Routes to School infrastructure projects or Safe Routes to School outreach and education, because there's kind of, I use the term interchangeably in both of those realms sometimes. So feel free to point me in a certain direction if you'd like me to talk more about infrastructure, if you'd like me to talk more about safety and education programming. That's kind of another direction we could talk about. But on the infrastructure side, with the TAP grant program here in Maine, all of our municipalities and our MPOs and RPOs are eligible to receive funding. So they'll apply with myself through MaineDOT each July 15th. We have an annual application period. July 15th is the due date to apply for an infrastructure project from this, what MaineDOT calls our Bicycle Pedestrian Program. And again, that's federal dollars. Federal Transportation Alternatives is the big federal term that comes from federal highway. And these funds are federal dollars. The grand scheme of things, it's federal gas tax revenue that comes through US DOT and Federal Highway Administration to each state Department of Transportation to administer as a grant program for things like bicycle and walking infrastructure. It could be a sidewalk, could be a safe pedestrian crossing, could be pedestrian lighting, could be a multi-use trail, could be intersection treatments or other safety treatments that happen to the roadway, or a pedestrian bicycle facility to improve that facility or create a new bicycle pedestrian facility. That's kind of the major points of that. There used to be an education component that was eligible under the federal TAP program that funded some things like educational campaigns around focused on drivers and how to drive safely around vulnerable road users, or other things that had to do more with engagement and education. The federal program no longer has that education component as an eligible project scope. So really what we're talking about these days with the TAP program is infrastructure. And that's what DOT works with municipalities on. Our grantees have to be municipalities. We don't allow nonprofits to be eligible for this program, but of course, enjoy working with nonprofits as, as partners as we develop projects and get things going here in the state of Maine. I apologize, someone might have to walk behind me here, but and so we work on projects generally throughout the entire life cycle of a project. So we'll go from helping a community to scope a project. What type of infrastructure are we talking about? Are we trying to go from point A to point B? Are we trying to reach a destination? Things like that. all the way through those preliminary conversations into what we call PE and right of way. That's design and acquisition of land or right of way to make a project happen, and then moving forward after that into construction and full implementation of the project. We tend to follow those projects that we fund through the entire life cycle, because we want to make sure anything we invest in actually happens. We don't like to spend money on engineering if it doesn't end up actually being implemented. So we tend to take these projects through their full life cycle. And then, most often working with a municipality, unless it's a DOT, piece of infrastructure that's being funded as well, then we have a municipal partner who we're working with closely to make sure that we meet their needs, and then they kind of take up the maintenance and operation of that facility or that project once the project has been fully delivered. But it's an 80-20 match percentage program. So the local applicant will bring 20%, we'll bring 80% of project costs in federal dollars. So it's a good deal from the local side of things, being able to bring such a high percentage of federal funds to your project. And another great thing is that we have kind of two implementation avenues to get a project done. At DOT, we have our local agencies program, which is where we let the municipality administer the project. The municipality will hire the consultants and the engineers and the contractors themselves and implement it according to both some DOT specifications and guidance, as well as federal guidance. Because this being a federal funding program, there are some strings and requirements that come along with this funding from the federal government as well. So we just need to make sure that we're compliant with that as well. If it's a smaller community, or if it's a community that's not able to administer the project themselves, then DOT will, in some cases, administer that project on behalf of the municipality. So that's kind of the quick rundown on the funding project, the funding program. To get a project to us, what I recommend usually is that a municipality reaches out, invites me to come out. We do a site walk. We check out the project, look at some maps. Talk about what the cost might be, what the benefits of the project are, what the ability of the municipality is to raise the match percentage or to administer the project, and iron out some of those details, and then walk them through that process so that they can submit an application by July 15th. Or it may be the case that they're not quite ready yet, so I help them with some things and they apply in the next year or something, but kind of helping them in that process in the beginning so that they're ready to put forth an application. Once we have applications on that July 15th deadline or before, we put together an internal scoring committee, score all of those applications. Our scoring criteria is on the website, and then applicants don't find out if they're successful or not until January. So it's about a 6-month window where you're just kind of waiting. But the great thing is, in the background on our end, what we're doing is we're scoring those projects, and then we're building those into our 3-year work plan. MaineDOT operates almost all of its expenditures on a 3-year kind of work plan cycle. It's a kind of a revolving set of projects, and we're always thinking 3 years out or so, planning the work so that we can make sure that we're allocating funds to projects that are ready, projects that are implementable, projects that are ready to be built. So we're probably in that 3-year span. If you have a successful project, the next year after your application, we'll be beginning design with you and targeting construction in that 2nd or 3rd year. So we're just kind of continually rolling that 3-year work plan along as we continue to deliver projects and then pick up new projects along the way. That's my quick presentation on how the program works. Happy to discuss what you guys are seeing there in Portland. If you're working with the city on some projects, I know I at least have some preliminary relationships with Jeremiah and Bruce at the city, and have talked to them about some things. I don't know, if you have projects you are talking about, or even with the schools, if you're, more of the safe routes to school approach, if you're working on some school connections in Portland as well. But happy to have some discussion.
Yeah, I think, I guess one quick question is, are you currently working on any safe routes to school related funding opportunities with Portland?
I
In case
am
we
not.
don't
I'm not that I know of with the city of Portland. We may, so I'm, being fairly new, I'm familiar with like the last 1 to 2 years of projects, the ones that are underway right now. I'm sure there are projects with the city that are older than that are finishing up or have already been implemented. I'm not aware of, at least myself, working currently on a project within the city of Portland.
Cool. I just wanted to make sure we weren't like, I don't know, doing redundant work.
Yeah.
Are there a lot of municipalities who are working with you for this funding?
So I'll say from a safe routes to school perspective, less. There are a lot of municipalities, and I'm sure you're aware of, a lot of interest in trails right now nationwide, and of course, here in Maine with some of the rail use advisory councils looking at those rail corridors, and potentially, we may be looking at a lot of rail trail projects in the future. So there's a lot of appetite in that regard. I tend to get less engagement from school specific connections. I'm working potentially on one in Thomaston and a couple of others, but the school ones really kind of come to me case by case basis as needed, whether, could be a select person or a city council person or someone who may work for the school system in general. So in the grand scheme of things, those are scored right alongside the other non-school transportation alternatives program applications. So it could be, we could, in any one year, we could fund a sidewalk to a school, a sidewalk on a neighborhood, a multi-use trail, and a pedestrian crossing. Or, it could be a kind of an array of different things depending on the year and which municipalities are ready for, to begin implementing their projects. The school ones are great though, and they tend to, to score fairly well. They hit a lot of our scoring criteria. And of course, safe access to schools is something that's important for, not just the local community, but something that DOT, certainly thinks is important as well. So they're the types of projects that tend to score well without having to do a lot of extra work, as long as there aren't any, unforeseen feasibility constraints or, problems that could arise in getting a project completed. But if it's a willing community that wants to work with us and has some, some ability to match the project financially, I think those are the types of projects that we really like to see, because they tend to be able to be pretty implementable as well.
Brilliant. Thanks for that context. Steve.
All right. What's the total pot of federal money that you're working with?
Yeah, so in the transportation alternatives program, or what we call
No, I meant the school. I meant the school program.
So that's right now that's the same thing. They used to have a separate allocation under transportation alternatives for safe routes to schools. Currently at the federal level, that's all one program now, but the safe routes to school projects are eligible under the larger transportation alternatives umbrella. It gets confusing a little bit. Sometimes the federal policy changes. It has to be reauthorized every few years. So sometimes it's reauthorized in a slightly different way. But right now, because of the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're just over $4 million a year for the transportation alternatives program. So that's where most of our safe routes to school projects would go. We do spend some of our what we call state multimodal funds on projects like this as well. So those are state funds, I believe, that are allocated to the department out of the state of Maine general fund, that are for projects that are not regular roadway, highway, bridge projects. So multimodal funds, things like bicycle pedestrian infrastructure, ferries, rail, those type of things that are not, not traditionally DOT highway type of stuff. So we do put some state multimodal funds into those types of projects. It really depends on the year and what projects we have ready and what kind of money we might have available at the time. But $4 million in federal funds from the Transportation Alternatives Program is what we're working with right now.
And I think you mean the transportation fund, not the general fund of the state.
Yes, I might. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for now.
Zach.
I have a comment and a question. With the schools in Westbrook, they moved the middle school basically to a farm pasture halfway between Portland and Westbrook, thereby eliminating any possibility that a child will get there any other way than a motor vehicle. And I was told that, well, that's because school construction funding is only for new construction. And so they moved the school out of downtown and put it where they did. So you have the state working at cross purposes, at least in my estimation.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on your comment. It's a super valid comment. I've had a few conversations about that as well. I actually had a consultant call me who's working on siting a new school for a municipality I won't mention because they're actually pretty close to Portland, but and that's one thing that we talked about when talking with that consultant about they're working on siting a school. They were interested in sidewalk funding and things, and that's one of the things I talked with them about was the proximity of that school to the community itself, and really trying to increase the success of people walking and biking to school, and thinking about that when they're when they were thinking about siting that school is keeping it close enough to the community where walking and biking could be a viable option to get folks to school is important. And that's something that a couple of other groups are working with as well. There's a group in Maine that's working on coordinating some walking school buses. So these are programs with teachers or parent volunteers to get students together who may not have reliable transportation to get to school, and provide them with a volunteer who can coordinate walking kids to school and provide a kind of a chaperoned walking school bus to get from neighborhoods to schools.
I just want to clarify the reason the schools get situated out in the middle of nowhere is the state requires for the state funding, if you want a school bond, that you have to have like acres and acres of land for play and sports fields. And those, so for instance, significant problem in building like the East End school because there just wasn't enough room. And they were like, oh, we can't possibly build a school there, because there's not enough room to build the acres and acres of play and sports fields you need. So that's the real issue why they get plopped out in the middle of nowhere. So
yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but I'll see if I can learn more about that.
Oh, sorry. I said they need all those sports fields because they're not walking or riding their bikes to school.
Well, I see.
My question is, you said you don't fund nonprofits, but a nonprofit could be a contractor of a municipality. Is that
potentially? It depends on the project scope and the type of things that we're working on. We've funded Bicycle Coalition of Maine, for example, for a number of years on some things. It really depends on the scope of work. Probably not for something that needs to be stamped by a professional engineer. That tends to not be something that falls under a nonprofit, but we do some coordinating work primarily with Bicycle Coalition of Maine, as our nonprofit partner, but it can depend on some things. And that's a kind of a rule that we have set as we work with a lot of federal money. We really take it into importance, federal compliance, because if we start to get in a place we shouldn't be with federal compliance, it really puts pretty much all of our programs in jeopardy, because we rely on so much federal funding at the DOT. There is, you may be familiar with the Federal Recreational Trails Program. That's a grant program managed out of the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. It's kind of a sister funding program to the Transportation Alternatives program, and that is federal funding. But DICF works closely with its applicants, and will grant funds to both municipalities as well as nonprofit partners.
Thanks. Maya. I think you're still muted.
Sorry, I don't go on Zoom much. I have two questions. My first question is, I want to clarify that the application has to come directly from the municipality. So would that be, it would have to come from the transportation department in Portland, or could it come from the Bicycle Coalition of Maine, for example, or could it come from the school department? That's my first question.
It would have to come from the municipality. So if the school is an arm of the municipality, it could come from the schools, but not from a nonprofit partner. We can work with nonprofit partners as we're scoping out projects and doing engagement and things like that. But we fully need the municipality on board for a couple of reasons. That has to do with project administration, spending federal dollars, as well as we really want to make sure we have local buy-in. And the best way to have local buy-in is to have a municipal signature on the paperwork. That way we know we have the select board or the city council really on board. We want to make sure that we're doing projects that have great public support from nonprofit partners, from groups like yours, but as well as from elected officials all the way up the board. The more support we can build for these types of projects, the better. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then my second question is, can the project be on like a physical engineering project on school property, or does it have to be on a state road?
It can be on a school property. So with the Transportation Alternatives Program, it can be on any of our state road network, local transportation network, or on a school. It would be very unlikely for us to do something on private property, but if it's open to the public, or public connectivity to a public facility in the transportation system. So libraries, schools, parks, roadways, downtown, those types of things would be pretty rare for us to do something on private property. We do have a program we call the Business Partnership Initiative, and that's a kind of a one-third program with the state, the municipality, and a private business entity, where we are trying to improve transportation or access from the public transportation system to the business. And that's, maybe what could fill some of that if there's something on private land.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So are there any specific projects that all of you are thinking about in Portland, or hoping that the city will be interested in taking up in the future in regards to school connectivity?
I think we're sort of in the beginning of this stage and trying to figure out what the existing opportunities are.
Mhm.
And I'll go to Mike, who might have thoughts on that himself.
I have some ideas, but I'm also in the process of learning what ideas the city might already have or not. I was in attendance at a recent conversation where the city presented some complete streets planning for a climate group in town. And I'm really interested in the nexus between climate action and active transportation planning. And I was interested to hear Bruce Hyman sort of describe some larger projects that the city is tackling, planning, but they're all 5 million plus projects, and not necessarily, and they're not TAP funded projects. And so that matches what you just said about how you've had some initial conversations with him and Jeremiah, but not necessarily like, here's our project, or here's our 3-year-old thing that's ready to get going. I would be very interested in being of whatever help I can, or nudging this group to be of whatever help it can in tapping into that funding source as well, because I think the need is there. And I am particularly interested in the Safe Routes to School stuff, although I understand that's not really formally a line item anymore. It's just sort of something that, as you said, scores well on certain grants and is not ignored, but is not really a fully funded project in and of itself. I'm very interested in the walking school buses. I would love to hear more about the group you were mentioning, because I've heard of only a couple of very small pockets in very isolated places in Maine where that's active. It was active in Portland. I'm sad to say that it's not anymore.
Yeah, there's sorry to cut you off. It's on the tip of my tongue. There's an organization called Count Me In, ME being ME Maine. And I believe I spoke with a Jessica Anderson from Count Me
Yeah.
In, and she's helping coordinate some of those walking school buses.
That's great. I've had a conversation with her as well, and so I'm glad to hear that that's the link, because it makes me feel less out of the loop. And I'm hoping that we can get some of those revitalized. That is maybe a great segue into my first of hopefully 3 questions, if Winston will let me. We have time. One of them is schools have come up repeatedly now already. And I'm wondering if and you just mentioned a DACF analog. Is there anybody in DOE at either, or any program in DOE at either federal or state level that's focused on how transportation and schools link? Because that is a huge part of our municipal budget and a very separate part of our municipal budget, as they are want to remind us every year. It's a huge piece of our communication puzzle, and as Steve was pointing out, like, not always one that's linked into like good transportation planning. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
I agree with you. I think there's still a bit of a disconnect between Department of Education, both at a federal level and at state and local levels, probably across the nation. I do occasionally call into the nationwide state Safe Routes to School coordinators phone call. So some DOTs across the country still have a full-time person who does nothing but Safe Routes to School work. MaineDOT has me, and I do a little bit of everything. But it's been nice to call in and meet some of those folks and see what other states are doing. Some of them, I think, are really in the same boat, where they'd like to work with departments of education. They'd like to work with some kind of coordinating body to help connect with schools in their states. And they're having varied success. Some have really found the right connection and are able to make that connection with the schools and the state agency, and some are struggling. So that I think is it's a little bit of a mixed bag across the nation. That way, there are some states doing things that I think we can learn from in the future. Minnesota, a couple of other states have some pretty interesting Safe Routes to School programs, but having only been here about 5 months, I haven't made my own connection with DOE yet. But when I get the chance to, I'd like to find the right person to connect to there and see what type of links we can make, at least with the programs that we have currently.
Thank you. That's great to hear. And secondly, as we have our discussions in this group about how to make things better for bicyclists and pedestrians, we often come to the question of speed and trying to reduce the speed of the larger steel vehicles around us. There seems to be some mixed understandings around, as far as I can tell, the whole state now, about who has the authority to reduce speeds and how to reduce speeds, and whether urban areas like Portland already have the authority to reduce speeds of their own accord, and if so, how? Just wondering if you have any, I understand you've only been here 5 months, but do you have any insight into those?
It's a popular topic these days. So right now, my understanding is that DOT is the agency responsible for speed setting across the state. There is authority for certain municipalities to take that upon themselves. My understanding is that in the last time period, sorry, I can't think of what it was at the moment, but in the last certain time period, there have been about 4 municipalities that took that authority on themselves and then have since actually given it back to DOT. So currently we are that agency, and there's a couple bills out there that deal with this right now and things. I think we definitely want to see safety, and I think something we don't want to see is the politicization of speed, because I have much more confidence in professional traffic engineers setting speed rather than speed setting happening in a politicized way. So that's the kind of the aspect that we're coming from there. I know there are a lot of conversations going on right now about speed setting and how we can do things. We do And we do have a kind of a menu of traffic calming measures that we're working on, and some gateway treatments, and hopefully over the next year or so, coming out of the active transportation plan, may have a little bit more of a well put together menu of things that we can do to increase voluntary speed compliance. So using tools like, speed tables, speed humps, bump outs, certain types of signage, speed feedback signs, different types of tools to start to design a roadway that promotes more compliant speed, rather than relying just on posted signs with a number on them and hoping that that's the speed that people are traveling. We're realizing that our law enforcement partners don't often have the capacity to do speed enforcement in a way that really keeps traffic at the posted speed. So we're looking at some of these other alternatives, some of the things that maybe certain places in Europe have been implementing for a while that we can learn from, and some other states are doing some other progressive things. So we're on the track to start to learn what we can do that's a little bit more out of the box.
Thank you. My third question is one you've already answered at the Bicycle Coalition Maine webinar, but I wanted to ask it again here because we have had some conversations about terminology. Your title is Active Transportation Planner. We've talked about that term versus bike ped coordinator. I've seen ped bike. I've seen, and I guess I'd love to hear your input in this forum as well as to, whether these are just interchangeable or whether there's subtle distinctions or important distinctions.
Yeah, I will answer to whatever you call me. But I've come around a little bit. I used to, when I first got this job, I was like, oh, bike ped, that's descriptive, it's specific. But I've come around more to biking active transportation as well, because there are a lot of things that deal with human scale transportation that may not necessarily be defined traditionally by what people think of when they hear bike ped. I deal with things that have to do with accessibility, folks who are using mobility devices for a variety of reasons, as well as micromobility like scooters and e-bikes and one wheels and all these types of things that we're starting to learn more about and hear more of. And human scale transportation is changing rapidly, across the world and the nation. We're seeing a lot of different trends and the types of devices that people are using to get around. So that's one of the reasons I like the term active transportation, is because it encompasses, whether you're on an electric scooter or you're on your own 2 feet or you're on a bicycle or an e-bike, all those types of things are what I'm interested in, what I'm working on. So, traditionally and to a large extent, it's still, bicyclists and pedestrians, but I'm very interested in how we can serve, all other types of kind of human scale transportation.
Thanks very much.
All right. I think we're getting toward about the point where we're a few minutes over, and I want to keep Dakota away from his evening too much further than he's already promised us. Are there any more clarifying or other questions? And is there anything Dakota would like to add?
So I'll just add, I moved to Maine in October, and it quickly became winter. So I'm looking forward to getting out in more places in Maine on my bike as spring comes along, and exploring Portland. I've been to Portland a number of times now and walked around downtown a lot, of course, but I'm really excited to spring coming and seeing some more things on my own 2 feet and on my bike. So that's something that I'm always open to. So if you have a project, you're working with the city on something or other partners, feel free to at least send me an invite, see if I'm available or not. I'm happy to come see a project, or come ride around Portland a little bit and see what things are like.
Brilliant. Yeah, we have somewhat frequent community rides and walk audits and things like that. So I'll include you in those invites in case you happen to be nearby or free. We might try to have a spring community ride. I haven't really thought of it yet, but we'll see. And yeah, specific projects too. I think we might sort of be talking about one later tonight. All right. Well, thanks so much, Dakota. And I'll let you go. You're free to hang out and be here for the rest of the meeting if you want. But I'm mindful of other things we've got to talk about. So
Yeah.
However you like.
I will
And I think we
probably
can-
drop off, but I did just put my email in the, oh, actually, I just sent it to Zach only somehow. I will put my email in the chat to everyone. In case you'd like to reach out, feel free to reach out anytime.
Cool. Yeah, we could have, someone might have another question. So if that happens, I'll make sure your email maybe ends up where people can see it on our group. And thank you so much for spending time with us tonight.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for the invite.
All right, thanks so much. All right.